Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The United States has threatened NATO ally Turkey with sanctions and a block on receiving F-35s because of its S-400 missile defense deal with Russia. Turkey is remaining strong in the face of this pressure. The U.S. says it cannot have F-35s flying over areas covered by S-400 systems, as that will give Russia an unfair military advantage. It wants Turkey to buy the U.S.'s less advanced Patriot missile system. The message this sends to the U.S. and others may be more about Turkey's strategic realignment, leaning on Russia as an ally. To firstly discuss that further, we're joined now by Air Vice Marshal Shahzad Chaudhry, who is a defense analyst, and he's joining us on the line from right here in Lahore. Mr. Chaudhry, as always, we appreciate your time. Can you just, Mr. Chaudhry, for the sake of our viewers, tell us about the F-35s themselves? We know that the U.S. has been working on this plane for a very long time now. Is this worth it for Turkey and others to sign on to that buying that plane?
Yeah, that's the new platform that the United States is working on. In fact, it's in production already, small batch production. And so that is the new fighter, the new generation, the fifth generation fighter that the United States Air Force and the NATO Air Forces will be working on. Obviously, all the NATO partners who want to buy the F-35 have made their shares available to the U.S. in terms of whatever numbers they wanted to buy and be a development partner as well in that. And so therefore, Turkey, of course, is counted as a NATO member interested in buying the F-35. So F-35 is the new generation of fighters, which will obviously will become a very, very popular fighter in the coming days. Well, some of the characteristics, of course, the main characteristic is it's called what is popularly known as the stealth fighter. So it's going to be a stealth fighter. It's going to be a long-range fighter. It will be low observable. The radars will not be able to detect it as easily. And so therefore, all that makes it possible for it to be a very effective platform for engaging targets at long ranges and within the domain of the weapons that it will be carrying. So I think that is the importance of F-35. Surely the new generation, which is going to replace in as massive a number as the F-16s were created initially.
And you know, Mr. Chaudhry, this has cost the U.S. And others a lot of money and a lot of time, as I said earlier as well. Turkey has also contributed parts, I believe, to the F-35 planes as well. Do you think that then of the U.S. concern then for such an expensive plane to be flying over areas covered by the S-400 possibly, that those concerns then about intelligence and data gathering that the S-400 can do about the F-35s, is that a valid military concern?
Militarily and from the point of view of the United States, yes, absolutely. I think they're absolutely right in suggesting that the F-35 in the areas the S-400 has been deployed is not a good idea, because these two are going to compete with each other and against each other. So you have two competitive forces, the F-35 in the air, the S-400 on the ground, meant to shoot down the F-35s. So therefore, when you have them flying in the same area or operating in the same domain, in the same airspace and the same ground space, then the chances are that the S-400 will be able to determine many of the characteristics of the F-35 in terms of the ranges when it begins to get picked up, the other frequencies, etc., which will make the S-400 more efficient in terms of its engagement options, etc. So therefore, yeah, the apprehensions are absolutely valid, and technically and operationally, the reasons are absolutely right in terms of the apprehension that the U.S. is showing towards selling F-35s to regions where the S-400 will be deployed.
Very well, sir. We'll leave it there at that. All right, we're going to say thank you there to Air Vice Marshal retired Shahzad Chaudhry, who was speaking to us on the line from right here in Lahore, giving his expertise on the F-35 as well as the S-400 versus Patriot systems. Let's add other voices to this conversation now. We're joined now by Mr. Giuliano Bifolchi, who is an Intelligence Unit Director at the Association of Studies, Research and Internationalization in Eurasia and Africa, known by its abbreviation ASRIE. He is joining us now from Rome via Skype. We're also joined by Nicolai Due-Gunderson, who is a political analyst at Kingston University. He is also the author of The Privatization of Warfare. He is joining us via Skype now from London. Nicolai and Giuliano, thank you both for joining us here in Scope. Giuliano, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of this row that has now erupted between Turkey and the U.S. over the F-35s versus the S-400?
First of all, good afternoon and thanks for having me. I would like to say that this is a long process which started probably in 2016 after the failed coup, when Turkey started accusing the United States of protecting the people who organized this coup. And this is one of the steps, probably one of the most important steps. I would like also to say that probably it is a part of the geopolitical game and also information warfare game between United States, Russia, and Turkey. And Turkey is...
And Nicolai, let me go to you, if I may, with that same question. What do you make of this row as it currently stands? Is this, do you think, more about military equipment, really, or is this genuinely just about the realignment, seemingly, that Turkey is going through?
Well, on the surface, there is some technical information. So the United States claims that they are worried that the S-400 system can track F-35 fighter jets. So that is the superficial concern. But underneath that, there is the geopolitical element, as my colleague was discussing. Tensions between Turkey and Trump are very, very high, going back to around summer 2018, when, as your colleague mentioned, we had the coup attempt 2 years before. And then on top of that, Andrew Brunson, who was a U.S. pastor, was detained in Turkey. And there was a row over that, which led to sanctions. And here we have, I think, the crux of the matter. Turkey under Erdogan, and let's remember he's got elections coming up, wants to send a message which is, listen, the United States is a waning player in the Middle East, and we know that there are other allies we can form, including with Russia and also possibly Iran.
But, you know, Turkey is vital, is it not, Nicolai, for the United States to protect its interests in the region? And, you know, the U.S. has offered the Patriot system, but Turkey is not dumb, right? It knows that the S-400 is overall a better system than the Patriot system, even according to military experts on both sides. So how do you think the U.S. will play this going forward, or will we just see rash decisions by Trump in this regard?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there, that it's very true that the S-400 system is supposed to be a superior system. At the same time, you know, Turkey is a NATO ally, okay, which is very important for its relations with the U.S. Yeah. And there were also claims from various sources that originally the F-35, parts from the F-35 were to be manufactured in Turkey. Yeah. Now, there are some U.S. sources that are claiming that the parts that were going to be manufactured by Turkey were limited and or they can just be relocated somewhere else. At the same time, I do feel that it still feeds into the geopolitics of the region. It's very interesting that Iran, Russia, and Turkey have had a series of meetings on the future of Syria. So setting aside whether or not the Syrian people should decide, they've had a series of meetings that the U.S. has not been involved in. And that kind of tells me that they are cutting the United States out. And I think that Trump himself, this is a president who makes rash decisions and who needs to be talked out of them. So he announces the withdrawal of troops from Syria, we're bringing the troops home, and then suddenly that announcement is extended and postponed because other people had to talk him out of it and say this is not a good idea.
All right, so let's bring Giuliano back. Tell us, Giuliano, about then this interesting you know, paradox that exists right now in Turkey, Giuliano, where Turkey is a NATO member, but at the same time, it is close now to Russia. What do you make of that?
Well, this is so strange, very strange. And probably this is also, there are some faults about the Americans, by the United States. And it's like the Turkish is using double standards policies, as in the past the West did, because it's a member of the NATO, but has this strong alliance now with Russia, and they try also to push harder to continue this alliance also in the natural gas field. And it's like that for the regional situation, regional cooperation, particularly for the Middle East, is Turkey doesn't want to be a NATO member or doesn't want to support the United States in the region. This is a strange situation, and I believe also that everything started in 2016 after the failed coup. It was also an excuse, or as Erdogan says, the reason why these relations start to deteriorate between the United States and Turkey. But I believe also that Erdogan wants to play a major role in the region, in the Middle East, in Syria particularly. And another question that is really important, another topic, is that the Kurdish situation, because Washington and Ankara, they are not on the same line.
Yeah.
So it's like that Turkey is trying to play its cards to also to find new allies. New allies, in particular in this case, is Russia, to try also to promote its foreign policy in the region.
So do you think, Giuliano, if I may stick with you, do you think, Giuliano, that the U.S. go as far as placing sanctions on Turkey over this issue of S-400?
Well, they say that they will put sanctions on Turkey, but think about the sanctions. Are really useful? The sanctions? Think about Russia. We put European Union, also the United States, they put sanctions against Russia, but Russia found a new way to avoid the problem and trust also to find new partners. If we put American sanction against Turkish, will also push Turkey to go more close to Russia, and there is another actor, China, within the Belt and Road Initiative. So in this case, if the Americans, the United States, they will lose completely the support or the majority of the support to Turkish in the region, probably they will face several problems. So I believe it's the things about the sanctions. Now it's more about strategic communication, about also political propaganda. Yeah. But the Americans, they should really think if they are really useful, these sanctions, because the history demonstrated that they are not so useful.
Very, very true. And I want to put that point then, Nicolai, what do you make? Because it seems, Nicolai, then, from this conversation we've had so far, it seems that Turkey is the one in the strong position here. Do you think that it will get then what it wants vis-a-vis both getting F-35s and the S-400?
I think that Turkey may have to make a decision on this one for a variety of reasons. I think that firstly, there's still tension between Trump and Erdogan, and that tension is enough that Trump may go with sanctions. It's possible. At the same time, Erdogan has elections coming up. The AKP party, his party, they are struggling somewhat. And I also know that Turkey is dealing with inflation and possible depression in its economy. This is a situation that started before the sanctions because of overlending in certain sectors, but sanctions have not been helping. So there are going to be other considerations that he has to take into account. But yes, at the same time, the geostrategic position of Turkey as a player between Europe and the Middle East and as a NATO ally should not be overlooked either.
So do you think, Nicolai, then Russia can come in and fill any gaps that may exist if the U.S. were to take any such action?
I think that they would be more than happy to do so. Russia right now, they're becoming a bigger player in the Middle East. Turkey is turning to Russia as well as a possible ally because they want to see the U.S. kind of cut out here. And also, let's not forget that Putin, he wants his payday. Putin has tried to offer Assad consistent support, but also he has said, in exchange for helping Assad rebuild Syria, we are the first in line for oil and gas contracts, because to the Russians, Syria can be a new energy hub. That means that they have very close relations with the regime, and that is something that Turkey may be interested in as well, especially if the U.S.'s strategy and its status in the Middle East in general is on the wane.
Very well. We're going to go into a very short break now, viewers. I'm going to ask Nicolai and Giuliano to stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation after the short break. Stay with us. Thank you, viewers, for staying with us as we continue to discuss this issue of the S-400 versus F-35 and the United States warning to Turkey about that issue. We're still joined by our esteemed panelists, Mr. Nicolai Due-Gunderson, who is joining us from London, and we're also still joined by Giuliano Bifolchi, who is joining us from Rome. Giuliano, let me continue with you, if I may, at this point. When we talk about Turkey and the United States and that relationship, I imagine the Israel factor is an important one as well, isn't it, Giuliano? Because I imagine Israel looks at any tensions between the U.S. and Turkey with a bit of alarm, because it also would like that relationship to be good, wouldn't it?
Well, Israel is an important factor in these bilateral relations between the United States and Turkey. And of course, Trump administration, the strategy of Trump administration in Middle East, particularly in Israel, regarding the capital, regarding Jerusalem, also the last statement about the Trump administration, are not well welcomed by Turkish.
Nicolai, what do you make of the Israel factor in all this? I imagine Israel not very keen on having these sorts of tensions between Turkey and the U.S.
No, certainly not. I think that Israel is in excuse me, Israel is in a difficult position in the Middle East. Obviously, Trump's recognition of the Golan Heights and also Jerusalem shows that he does want to support Israel's government and Benjamin Netanyahu at a time when elections are going to take place in Israel. Of course, Israel watches any tension with alarm because the U.S. is basically their main Western supporter in the region. Some would argue it's almost their only supporter in the region. So if there's tension between Turkey and the U.S. and others, they do watch that with alarm. And at the same time, I think that Turkey under Erdogan, one of the things he's tried to do is he's tried to say, listen, I can lead not just Turkey, I can lead the Islamic world. So when Trump has had these responses and has said, look, we recognize Jerusalem as part of Israel, we recognize the Golan as part of Israel, the first thing that Erdogan has done is he said, we're going to have an emergency summit with the Islamic organization of countries, and we're going to say that this is a red line. And the reason he's taken these decisions is because he wants to show that he can lead the wider Muslim world. This is an issue because most of the Middle East is Muslim, and Israel in this sense stands alone. So they would be very alarmed by any moves that create more tension in the region and that also could undermine U.S. moves within the Middle East.
And, there have been a lot of tensions, haven't there, even just between Turkey and Israel, Nicolai. So I wonder, going forward, though, as we had contextualized, Turkey is important. It's an important player in this region, both militarily and for just simply geostrategic reasons as well. It's a large country. Its economy is doing quite well ever since Erdogan especially has come into power. So, I mean, how do you think that all plays into this? Do you think Israel also has been a bit too rash in the way it's acted towards Turkey?
Well, I think that Israel may have to be a bit more careful with its relationship with the Arab world and with Middle Eastern states in general. I do feel that because Netanyahu is seen as someone who's a bit more extreme as a leader compared to previous Israeli leaderships, when Trump has supported Jerusalem and Golan, these moves have empowered him and Netanyahu empowered him and empowered his government, and that perhaps this has encouraged him to go further than he should have. And I think that that's a problem that they will have to address to enjoy wider relations with other Middle Eastern states in the next 5 to 10 years. That has to be addressed.
Giuliano, I wanted to bring you back in. And one of the major factors, obviously, when it comes to Turkey-U.S. relations is also Syria. And obviously, as we well know, and as was mentioned earlier as well, Russia, Turkey, and Iran have been part of a process, at least trying to bring some semblance of peace and some semblance of a ceasefire in parts, at least, of Syria. Do you think that the U.S. appreciates the role that Turkey can play in that regard?
I don't think so. Speaking honestly, I don't think so. Also because, first of all, Turkey, in talking with only Iran, and that is now the enemy, one of the biggest enemy of the United States and Russia, is confirming the fact that doesn't want to follow the guidelines of the strategy of the United States. So this fact that Turkey is playing a major role, important role, and the United States is losing their appeal and also their influence in the region, I don't think that.
Nicolai, I'll ask you then about the Kurdish question when it comes to Syria, because that's obviously, many people have looked at that situation with a bit of alarm. Do you think that these two countries are willing to have a standoff, a direct standoff about that?
Well, I think that certainly the Kurds have been the most alarmed. I would have agreed with you that there could have been a standoff until Trump announced his withdrawal. Now, although that withdrawal has not happened immediately, that announcement sent a message to the Kurds, which is that we cannot trust Washington. And of course, Turkey regards all Kurdish militias in Syria as terrorists. So here we have a problem. We now see a situation in which the Kurds may find that their de facto protector, if I use that term, is going to actually step down activity rather than step up activity. Trump announced the withdrawal as part of a move where he implied that the United States should no longer police the Middle East if it doesn't get anything in return. Whether or not he follows through on that promise is going to have to be seen. But obviously that kind of rhetoric is alarming to the Kurds, I think, for the most part. But
I imagine, Nicolai, that with the I believe it's the 100 or 200 U.S. forces who will be remaining in Syria, if I'm not mistaken, I imagine that the U.S. will still defend the Kurds, will it not? It will have no choice, really, would it, if Turkey, for example, were to attack their areas?
No, that's quite correct. I mean, withdrawal would happen over time, and as you correctly pointed out, it doesn't mean that there are no ground forces whatsoever. There are going to be troops, and there are troops stationed who would also train the Kurds. But yes, when push comes to shove, this is going to be the main question. So we already have a lot of tension between Trump and Erdogan. Should there be such a situation, we're going to see even more. And I think that the U.S. would then be forced, those on the ground would be forced to help the Kurds defend themselves. And that could lead to a physical confrontation, which would make tensions increase even further.
Okay, I'm just going to give the final word to Giuliano. If you can hear me clearly, just tell us about your thoughts about the Kurdish areas in Syria. Do you think that there will be a standoff at some point between the U.S. and Turkey there?
I believe that the Kurdish area will be a tricky point, but will also a card that Turkey we use against the United States. I believe so. Also because it's clear that Turkey would like to overcome these problems, would like to fix the problem with the Kurdish area, using its strategy, its methods. It's clearly completely clear. But we should also say that the United States, they would like to support the Kurdish, and particularly in the area like in Syria. And Kurdistan and Kurdish, they can play a role also to contrast in some way Turkey. So they can become also geopolitical actors in the hands of the United States. So I believe that at one point, the American administration and the Turkish government, they should face this problem. They should find a solution. Also, we should also consider the fact that Russia is trying to use this situation for not only in a geopolitical way, but also for the energy market, trying to invest in the Kurdistan area.
Indeed. Okay, we'll leave there as a final word, but of course, appreciate both of your times, of course, and insight and analysis. That was Giuliano Bifolchi, Intelligence Unit Director of the Association of Studies, Research and Internationalization in Eurasia and Africa. He was speaking to us from the Italian capital. We were also joined by Nicolai Due-Gunderson, who is a political analyst at Kingston University and also author of The Privatization of Warfare. He was speaking to us from the British capital. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, we started off obviously with Air Vice Marshal Shahzad Chaudhry, who spoke about the technical details and about the concerns that the U.S. has. The F-35s and the S-400 cannot, in one area, both be functioning, simply because that does not make sense militarily. So that concern, seemingly, at least on paper, is valid. But then there's a lot more politics at play here. It's not just about the military equipment. We've spoken about the many areas of disagreements between Turkey and the U.S., be it Syria, be it other areas as well, even areas such as Israel. There are tensions between Israel and Turkey as well at this point. And then obviously the major tension being that Turkey is a NATO ally and is simultaneously now allying itself with Russia, which does seem paradoxical in many ways. We'll keep a close eye on how that situation develops and if the U.S. actually takes any measures against Turkey if it does begin receiving the S-400 missile systems. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. Now, 200 asylum seekers were rescued off the Libyan coast from their rickety boat. When informed they were to return to Libya, they took over the ship that rescued them. Italian officials say this is the first case of piracy on the high seas by migrants. But migration experts have called for more understanding, saying conditions in Libyan camps are dire. Now in Malta, these refugees and others who embark on these perilous journeys are part of a larger debate on human trafficking, the genuine needs for asylum, and an anti-migrant wave sweeping across Europe. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by our esteemed panelists, Mr. Alberto Bitonti, who is a professor of politics at Università della Svizzera Italiana in Switzerland and at IES Abroad, Rome. He's joining us now from Rome itself. We're also joined with Mr. David Nyheim, who is the chairman of the International Conflict and Security Institute. He's joining us now from Valletta in Malta. And we're also joined then on the line from Bristol by Mr. Richard Thickpenny, who is Deputy CEO of ACH, and he's Deputy Chief Executive Officer, I should say, at the Ashley Community Housing, and is an expert on refugees and asylum seekers. Thank you all for joining us. If I may, Richard, I'd like to start with you. When you heard about this case, and I believe it first came out because of a statement of Matteo Salvini, if I'm not mistaken, what did you make of this? Is this an example of piracy?
I think in terms of the laws of the sea, yes, it is a case of piracy. But it's the extremists that's forced people to take that action, which I think moves it away from the traditional piracy of sort of hijacking ships for ransoms. This is actually hijacking a ship to save potentially their own lives.
Okay. So, David, what do you make of that? Because then as the expert yourself, David, I imagine, and being in Malta yourself, I imagine that those countries are looking at this with a bit of alarm, aren't they?
Under the laws of the sea, this is an act of hijack and a criminal act. But if you look at the safety of return for these refugees to Libya, and the statement by UNHCR last year that Libya is unsafe for returns, then this is also an act of trying to save one's own life and the lives of those that one cares for.
At that point that you just made there, David, is that being appreciated there inside itself? Are the Maltese understanding that point, or do you think that they are looking at this with a bit of nervousness?
I have a feeling that this is something that, of course, makes Europeans nervous, because it is the first time this has happened, and it feeds into a broader narrative which looks at the migrant and refugee issue as a security issue.
Okay, so Alberto, then give us a point of view from Italy itself, because you know well, Alberto, the Salvini government and you know all the other officials that make up the Italian government have made their feelings very clear about this wave of migrants that come over, saying other European countries need to do more. Salvini calling these people pirates, basically, those who took over this ship. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the securitization of the issue that Richard mentioned before, David mentioned before, actually in the political environment is something that is pushing really hard some of the parties, not only in Italy but throughout Europe, that are really pushing their tones on immigration and their anti-immigration campaigns, also in view of the next European elections. So what they're trying is not only to deal with the issue and try to establish, to reach a consensus on what are reasonable ways to deal with the problem, but to ride that politically in order also to harvest electoral consensus. So I'm not sure that for all of these parties the best solution is to really deal with the solution with a reasonable solution, but also to maintain this messy situation in order to harvest electoral consensus.
Then tell us about the politics of all this, Richard, because you know many people, Richard, that one of the major reasons that the Brexit vote worked out the way it did was because of anti-migrant feelings, not necessarily just migrants from or asylum seekers from North Africa / the Middle East, but also simply migrants from within Europe itself. How does that play out in the context of the UK then?
It's quite visible in many aspects of daily life now. So in terms of European migrants, they've come in as a necessary labour resource. So there's something like 2.5 million jobs have been created in the UK economy over the last 10 years. And economically, we've actually had to import labour to cover those jobs. We've got a standard rump of about 1 million to 1.25 million of unemployed within the UK, and many of those may never come into the workplace. So if the economy grows and there's a need for labour, then we have to import. I think where it became an issue is from 2004 onwards, when Poland and other countries came into the European Union, or the freedom of movement brought those populations in. Within the UK, there was a narrative that said being against immigration was being racist. And so it just set up a resistance to this quite a significant competition for jobs. So especially around jobs like warehousing, care, working in pubs, in the hospitality industry. And in terms of the EU legislation, the UK couldn't stop the European migrant, the economic migrant. So it had the opportunity to actually close the doors to all those from non-EU countries, and at the same time trying to make the Home Office cost neutral. So it now charges a considerable amount for non-EU nationals to come into the country.
Right.
So it allowed.
If I may just come in, if you allow me, Richard, I wanted to, if you allow me, bring up another aspect of this entire conversation. David, Operation Sophia, as the EU called it, has been, at least its sea operations have now been stopped, I believe. And that, of course, at the request of Italy itself, which is standing quite strong on this issue. What are your thoughts about that? Because, many people would say that Operation Sophia did save, and, the statistics don't lie, they saved about 49,000 people trying to reach Europe. It also arrested, and this may be the more important part, it arrested about 150 traffickers. And that's an argument which doesn't come up very often. This issue of human traffickers, that is a factor which is very important in this entire conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, look, I think the human trafficking side has been emphasized or overemphasized in many ways, because the key issue here is the enabling environment that facilitates human trafficking, and that is the conflict situation in Libya and instability in other countries that in a sense are source countries for refugees. So from my vantage point, yes, the upside of Operation Sophia was the saving of lives. The downside of it has been a shift away from some of the real causes of this issue, which is basically instability and conflict in Libya, instability and conflict in Syria.
Okay, that's a very good point. Alberto, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I think then, as David there correctly said, the conversation about human trafficking does come up. But then on the other side, when it comes to those who sympathize with the refugees, they don't talk as much about that. At least that's my personal opinion on this. But Alberto, then what no one really talks about enough on top of all of this is the fact that there's a root cause to all of this happening. The instability that David mentioned, be it in Libya, be it in Syria, or be it in other parts of the world, in Africa or elsewhere. Do you think that that is something that Europe needs to actually tackle, needs to actually bring peace and stability to places like Libya and Syria with more fervor?
Well, I think that when it comes to root causes, you need to focus on two aspects. One is the real root causes that are civil wars or instability in the MENA countries, in the Middle East and Northern African countries. And so over there to think about, the Syrian crisis that, of course, and that allowed the rise of Daesh and that produced millions and millions of refugees, not only in the Middle East, but not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East itself, like in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey. So we need, the international community needs to really focus on this and try to think of political solutions in order to make these areas more stable and try to deal with these conflicts, even if, of course, it's not so simple, considering that especially Syria was a proxy war used by many international global players such as Russia or US, in order to fight their own fights in that war, also without a real interest in the good of the Syrian people. And the second aspect is about the immigration policies enforcement. In order to really fight human traffickers and enforce a good immigration policy, well, you need to have a state. That's very simple. And so whenever you don't have such a strong actor, such a strong player who can enforce these policies, well, you have a vacuum. And wherever there is a vacuum, you can find traffickers and any type of illegal organizations, such as organized crime as well, or mafias that see an advantage, see an opportunity to make money, of course. Okay. And so the lack of a strong state in Libya is another crucial factor in this area.
Okay. So then, Richard, I wonder what you make of that, because for any country, be it the UK, be it Italy, be it Malta, they need to take their national security concerns also into and factor that in, obviously, when they're responding to this wave, this human wave, as it's been called at times, of these people seeking asylum, fleeing persecution / war in other parts of the world. How does one do that, do you think, Richard?
I think there's a need to have a really good look at policy, because you see with Angela Merkel 4 years ago, when she invited 1 million Syrian refugees into her country, it created a whole industry in Turkey which probably totaled about 1.5 million or 1.5 billion euros worth of new business for organized gangs. And once that wave went through, you've then got a whole... Where do the organised gangs go to get their money? So they've gone to Libya because again they can earn money. So
So I wonder on that point of organized gangs, Richard. I wonder then, do these, because a lot of us when we hear what Salvini says, for example, in Italy, it sounds very extreme sometimes. But do you think that these sorts of politicians, even those on the far right, do have a point then about European security then?
It's more about European protectionism rather than security. So what they're always doing is creating a fight, just as they had with the drugs wars, all through the 20th century and into this century. Now they've got the anti-economic migrant war, so there has to be bad people that have to be controlled. But I think the fact that they've actually been instrumental through that push from Turkey into Greece a few years ago, they've actually been instrumental in creating the very gangs which they now have to sort of try and reduce. So there's a policy to actually manage the flow, in which in some aspects is now happening, where there's a points-based migration service. So actually people coming from refugee countries, there is at least a defined opportunity, whereas at the moment large amounts of people are trying to get there in the hope that perhaps they would get in. So if there was a better policy all the way through into countries like Lebanon and Jordan, where refugees are sort of staying as sort of locally displaced people, then it could stop that local displacement moving into cross-national migration.
Okay, so one factor I wanted to bring up, David, with you is that of, well, we haven't even spoken about this yet, but what's to say, and that has been a concern, I know that's been brought up a number of times by security experts, about ISIS members themselves, or now possibly former ISIS members, just fleeing Syria, for example, or Iraq, and claiming asylum elsewhere. Those it's not as easy to trace who was ISIS, who wasn't ISIS, is it? So I imagine for all of the above countries, such as your own in Malta, that would be a huge concern too, right? We don't always know who these asylum seekers are.
Well, look, before I address that question, I just want to pick up on a point made by Richard, which is, and also one that you have made, Waqar, on in terms of the size of this issue. Lebanon has been mentioned, and Lebanon hosts between 1 and 1.5 million refugees, which basically constitutes about 15% of their population. The European refugee population is about 22.3 million refugees, or about 0.5%. And the EU's GDP is around 370 times the GDP of Lebanon. So I think it's very important here to put this problem in perspective as one which is called a crisis, not because of the magnitude and size of it, but because it is being so poorly managed, and also because it is happening at a time when there is increasing and blatant disregard for human rights and refugee law across Western democracies. And the security and securitization of the issue is part of this problem, or part of what makes it a problem. And I think we need to be very mindful of that in terms of how we frame these issues, because we have the means and capability to deal with them well, but we have not.
Okay, so Alberto, I'll give you the final word then, Alberto. Make of what's been said so far, and additionally, if I may add on that this concern, which I imagine many countries will see as genuine, is that we don't always know who these people are who are coming over in these boats. What if there are former Daesh members in those boats? How does a country deal with that then, Alberto?
Well, I think that very often the public debate is affected by these narratives that make it a huge problem. I very much agree with what David just said. And so that many political parties like Salvini's party in Italy, or Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, or the Front National in France, actually support this narrative of a challenge, of a threat that we are facing as national states, as France, as Italy, as Europe, against the other. Now, it's a very old issue, of course, who is us and who are the others. And we need to be very clear about the flexibility of this boundary between what is us and what are the others, and national identities and European identities and religious identities, because when these different identities are intertwined in different and overlap in different cleavages, well, that can be a risk. About ISIS or Daesh, I think that we need to always analyze what were the reasons behind the rise of this phenomenon. And I think that one very underestimated factor in the success of Daesh, its rise, was the policy of integration by the new Iraqi government in the Sunni population of Iraq.
Right.
Because they, with the new government in Iraq after the US intervention, they had a very restrictive policy against the Sunni population of Iraq. And so many of these people who were before enrolled in the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein were just left with no alternative than either be unemployed or be enrolled in this new organization that could be ISIS. So,
and that's a very good part. I'm going to stop you right there, Alberto. I do apologize, but that's a very good point to conclude on. And that leaves something to discuss for next time when we have all of you back on to continue this conversation. We've only obviously just touched the tip of the iceberg on this, but we appreciate all of your times and insight and analysis. That was Professor Alberto Bitonti, Professor of Politics at Università della Svizzera Italiana in Switzerland and at IES abroad, Rome. We were also joined by Mr. David Nyheim, who is the chairman of the International Conflict and Security Institute. He'd been speaking to us from Malta. And we were also joined on the line by Mr. Richard Thickpenny, who is a Deputy Chief Executive Officer at the Ashley Community Housing. He was speaking to us from Bristol. Now, viewers, as we spoke about there, we started off obviously from this specific incident itself and what it means. And yes, according to international law, what occurred there on the high seas is technically piracy, but it was not done with criminal intention necessarily, in the sense that this was to save lives, I believe, as David had said in one of his answers. But then this does then open up a further debate about how Europe has reacted overall to what it has called a human wave, what many far-right parties have called a human wave of people. But in context of countries like Lebanon and Jordan, that point was made too in conversation. Europe hasn't actually taken in that many people in context and can be doing a lot more, both vis-a-vis security of itself and taking in more humans and being more humane overall in an organized fashion. We'll keep a close eye on that situation because, unfortunately, this is not the last of such incidents that we'll see on the high seas and the Mediterranean here in Scope. But thanks for watching this edition. I've been Waqar Rizvi.